event. This is one of my all-time favorite poems, and I love teaching poetry in general, but this poem I find especially apt for our time. It is my theory that the whole world is undergoing what the spiritual writers call a dark night, and The Wasteland, I believe, is one of the great poetic engagements with that reality of the dark night. I also link that theme of the dark night to what is called apocalypse, which is not necessarily the colloquial view of something massive and horrible happening in the world, though in fact, when such events happen, that is a time to be aware of what apocalypse really is, which is an unveiling. And like the last book of the Bible, the Revelation or Apocalypse to St. John, the reality here, I believe that T.S. Eliot is also tapping into, is that apocalypse or unveiling, which we are more aware of in times of crisis, is in fact something that is a revelation of what is always the case, the deep structure of things. In fact, that's what I believe the creative chaos of the Dark Night is there to show each of us, that we have to go into ourselves, and as a world, hopefully we can do this together. And I believe that poetry is absolutely essential in accomplishing that task. So that is going to be one of my suggestions in reading this wonderful, it's an astonishing poem that for me has always meant so much, even from high school days. Reading T.S. Eliot, even though I was always baffled by this poem, it's taken, you're never done exploring the depths of a great poem, and this one continues to run me through the ringer, and I hope we all find that together again today. Every time I teach this, it is an amazing experience, and I hope that we all will be able to engage it very energetically. When I was younger, reading the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, the Four Quartets, and The Wasteland, and the other great poems, Ash Wednesday and Journey of the Magi, and so on, T.S. Eliot means a lot to me and to so many others, and it's hard to exactly get a grip on why. The music and the magic of T.S. Eliot is very hard to pin down. There's very little critical consensus about the meaning of the Wasteland. I do not intend to sit here as a guru, and I always refuse that as a teacher. I'm here to offer what knowledge I have about T.S. Eliot to help guide things, to kind of trim away readings that may not make a lot of sense. But in the end, any great poem is going to be polyvalent. There's going to be so many meanings, and that's part of the joy of the thing. So I'm going to advance a certain reading, but certainly that is not the last word. The last word is the poem itself, and it renews itself every time we read it. Eliot was a prankster. He, you know, from some of the poetry that's out there, like Old Possum's Book of Cats, which Cats is loosely based on, he had a playful side. In a lecture he gave at Harvard, many decades after writing The Wasteland, he says, various critics have done me the honor to interpret the poem in terms of criticism of the contemporary world, have considered it indeed as an important bit of social criticism. To me, it was only the relief of a personal and wholly insignificant grouse against life. It is just a piece of rhythmical rumbling. Now, he's being funny there, I think, but he's also indicating that there are deep personal sorrows underlying this poem, and that would be what one would expect. One of the greatest enunciations of the kind of desolation that a person can enter into, the darkest of dark nights, has to come from something that he knows personally. But the fact is, it is a statement on the modern world. It's a statement about where we are, and it's a statement about us now, I believe. And in that great essay from the first volume of criticism of his that got published, Tradition and the Individual Talent, a book I read early on, and it again, his words are always so far in front of one, but it caused me to develop as a person. And eventually in my own life, when I hit a dark night, poetry came out of that darkness, and T.S. Eliot's words were there. One of the claims he makes in Tradition and the Individual Talent is that a new great work of art comes into the canon, as it were, and changes the past. It causes the meaning of the whole tradition to change. And so certainly The Wasteland has done that, and also our reading of The Wasteland continues, and it continues to add meaning to the whole. So I believe that The Wasteland is a statement of the personal and the historical together, and I hope to be able to point out some things that make that very clear. He writes in Tradition and Individual Talent, the struggle which alone constitutes life for a poet to transmute his personal and private agonies into something rich and strange, something universal and impersonal. The great poet, in writing himself, writes his time. So T.S. Eliot was born in St. Louis in 1888, and he died in London in 1965. His family had Boston Brahmin roots. They were from a long line of Unitarians, very prim and proper. They spent summers in Gloucester on Cape Ann. Eliot's mother, Lottie, wrote poetry, and that obviously mattered a lot to young Tom, as he was known. Young Tom suffered from a congenital double hernia, which kept him from team sports, and that isolated him socially. He turned to books. He reminisced once that Missouri and the Mississippi have made a deeper impression on me than any other part of the world. Now, again, that's probably overstatement, but it's something to remember that alongside Paris and alongside Oxford and London and Harvard, there is the Mississippi and St. Louis. He spent a year attending Milton Academy to prepare for Harvard. At Harvard, he studied comp lit as an undergrad from 1906 to 1909, and then he studied English literature the following year. He was very moved during his undergrad years by reading the French symbolist poet Jules Laforgue, and that had a great effect on his poetics. By 1911, he had written the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. It's astonishing that a 23-year-old, I mean, I'm jealous of it anyway. From 1910 to 1911, Eliot studied at the Sorbonne, attending lectures by Henri Bergson. He was in Marburg, Germany, when the war broke out. He was back at Harvard from 1911 to 1914 doing doctoral work in philosophy. During his Harvard years, he studied under Irving Babbitt, George Santayana, R.G. Collingwood, Bertrand Russell, and Josiah Royce. He was awarded a scholarship to study at Oxford in 1914. He had fallen in love with a woman named Emily Hale, and some of you have heard the release of those letters from Princeton, but thought he had been rebuffed by her. That love was important. That was his first real love, and in a way, his subsequent disastrous marriage was a reaction to what he took to be Emily Hale's non-acceptance of his advances. He met Ezra Pound later in 1914, who would go on to promote Eliot's poetic career. Pound, no matter how problematic his life, and it was problematic, he cared about cultivating young talent, and that is a thing that's very rare in literary circles. He was a master impresario. He was, at that time, Yeats's personal secretary. Pound was conspiring to keep Eliot in England because he thought that Eliot's poetic way forward lay in England, not in the States and in an academic job. Eliot, in fact, was dreading the life of an academic philosopher. In 1915, he was introduced to Vivian Hay Wood, and they were married June 26th of that year, having known each other only 3 months. Vivian had had an engagement broken off the previous year by her parents, who thought that the young man had to be saved from her large suite of physical and psychological complaints. And in fact, she had been pretty seriously involved with a friend of Eliot's, Schofield Thayer, just before the Eliot and she married. The marriage was a disaster. And that was part of the background of The Wasteland. Eliot wrote a dissertation on knowledge and experience in the philosophy of F.H. Bradley, who was a prominent idealist philosopher. But in the end, he did not choose to pursue the viva voce examination necessary to get the degree. Eliot taught at schools to earn a living, and finances were extremely precarious. Vivian's constant neurasthenic complaints and the money worries were just very difficult for both of them. Bertrand Russell was very well, he was both a patron to them, but also in the end had an affair with Vivian. It was a very messy situation. Eliot supplemented their income by writing book reviews and literary criticism. And in fact, his literary essays had decisively shaped that academic enterprise. He eventually got a position at Lloyd's Bank in London, where he worked from 1917 to 1925. His marriage was always a source of pain, and Eliot himself was a nervous sort. Even though he was tall and handsome, he was, again, on the outside physically. He was always sexually nervous up until the marriage. It was a tough combination of personalities. Eliot would later write, "I came to persuade myself that I was in love with Vivian simply because I wanted to burn my boats and commit myself to staying in England. And she persuaded herself, also under the influence of Pound, that she would save the poet by keeping him in England. To her, the marriage brought no happiness. To me, it brought the state of mind out of which came the wasteland." Eliot composed The Wasteland more or less in 1920 and 21. It was published in 1922. That was the annus mirabilis of literary modernism. The Wasteland is the great poetic work of modernism, and that same year saw the publication of James Joyce's Ulysses, the supreme monument of modernism in prose. I think I'll bracket the rest of his biography at this point, except to say that he separated from Vivian in 1932, who was committed to a mental hospital by her brother in 1938, where she died in 1947. Eliot published the 4 quartets in 1943. Afterwards, he concentrated on writing plays. He didn't do poetry really anymore. Eliot was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1948 and married Valerie Fletcher in 1957, which turned out to be a very happy marriage. One note about the poem as a whole, and I hope to explore it with you, but the epigraph that Eliot had originally put on the poem was from Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Did he live his life again in every detail of desire, temptation, and surrender during that supreme moment of complete knowledge? He cried in a whisper at some image, at some vision. He cried out twice, a cry that was no more than a breath. The horror, the horror. That's a very impactful epigraph. In the end, the epigraph, which I don't think was included, oddly enough, on the Poetry Foundation link that some of you will be using, and I will be reading off of for today's discussion. Ezra Pound wanted the Conrad quote cut. And in the end, what Eliot settled on was something from the Satyricon. Nam sibulam quidem cumis ego ipse oculis meis vidi in ampulla pendere et cum illi pueri dicerent. Sibula titeles respondebat illa apothenein thelo. Now this is a very different kind of epigraph. It's not in English. It's in 2 different classical languages, both Latin and Greek. So that's a little forbidding. Like it's a warning to those who would enter here, abandon hope. But it's a quote about this Cumaean Sibyl suspended in her bottle, who had asked for as many years of life as in the grains of sand in her hand. And Apollo, not being a nice dude, said, granted her the wish, but did not give her youthfulness to go along with longevity. And so when this person sees the Sibyl with his eyes, the Sibyl is asked, "What do you want, Titheles?" And she says, "Thelo, apothenein, I want to die." And if one thinks about this poem as somehow a biography of the mind of Europe along with the mind of Eliot, then I think the death instinct, the Thanatos syndrome of the West is, I believe, not unrelated to what we're going to experience in this amazing poem. So what I would like to see in terms of the way we do this, it's never going to be enough time, but about 10 to 15 minutes for each section, along besides the reading of each section, I want to get as much feedback from you all as far as the images. Again, there is something completely irreducible about a poem of this complexity on top of its genius. And the point isn't to resolve all the ambiguities, but to really come to take the many voices to heart. And that's just a brief suggestion about reading poetry. One needs to take the word choices very seriously, the music, the rhythm of the thing, and then the images. Those are the basic things that one has to attend to. Historical background matters, but the integrity of the poetic structure itself is the first thing I think to get right. And I would ask us to all hear the different voices. The original title of the first two sections of the poem was He'd Do the Police in Different Voices, which is a line from a Dickens novel where he's accentuating the fact that there's lots of voices here. And if we can kind of get those in our head and try to see, is there a logic here? Is there a plot? Is there a narrative voice? Or is it an irreducible plurality of voices? And is this a lyric, dramatic, or epic poem? In fact, it's probably all of those, but we'll see. And I will note that there are going to be references to the Book of Revelation, which I think justify my point, other than the basic fact of this being an apocalyptic poem and how we want to cash that out, we will get to right now. So any initial questions, comments?